some of her work. Okay, this meeting is being recorded. Hope that's fine with everybody. Jane is going to be presenting. For those of you who don't know Jane, Jane is a research officer in the adolescent hub in the CSSR. She did her PhD psychology here at UCT, and then worked for the provincial government, and then moved to the hub in the CSSR. I was going to say last year, but I have a terrible suspicion that in fact it was last year. My sense of time, we were talking about this earlier, but my sense of time has become a bit warped. So Jane is going to be presenting work which is based on her PhD research. She'll talk for up to half an hour, and then we have half an hour for discussion. If you've got questions, please raise your hands. I'll try and notice you, or you're welcome to put your questions in the chat session. So Jane, over to you.
Jane, you're on mute.
Is that better?
Yes, it is. Thanks, Jane.
Sorry. I was saying to Diana earlier, I'm used to Teams, so when I switch to Zoom, I've just got to get into the Zoom mode, but I'm here now. Yeah, thanks for that introduction, Jeremy. I'm really excited to be presenting on this work, and as Jeremy said, it's based on my PhD in psychology. And I was looking back yesterday, and I can't believe it. So I did this in between 2015 and 2018. Yeah, a lot has happened since then, but I think that some of my findings are still relevant today. Before I start, just some quick acknowledgements. So I was very fortunate to have Kathy Ward as my supervisor, and those of you who know her, she's one of the best supervisors there, so thank you to Kathy. And thanks to my funders, Harry Crossley Foundation and the Centre of Excellence in Human Development. And of course, the participants who I interviewed, and they were just amazing in sharing their stories. Just to give a little bit of background to this particular study. So as we all know, gangs are found all over the world, including in South Africa. And in Cape Town specifically, gang involvement has been identified as a really critical problem. It has ties to organized crime and drug dealing. Unfortunately, we don't have an idea of actually like the extent or the prevalence of gang involvement. There's some estimates from the late 1990s that there were about 80,000 to 120,000 gang members in Cape Town at that time. But my study doesn't look at kind of gang involvement. It actually looks at the idea of gang desistance. Most studies on desistance to date have actually come from high income countries, where socioeconomic conditions are obviously very different to low to middle income countries like South Africa. And there's very little research that has actually explored the idea of desistance from the perspective of former gang members in low to middle income countries like South Africa. And the reason why this is important is because it has implications for policymakers, the criminal justice system, and how we can develop effective interventions. So if we have a better understanding of how individuals are able to desist from gang involvement, we can be better equipped when it comes to actually intervening with youth who are in gangs. So in light of the gap in evidence specific to South Africa, this study aimed to explore how a group of former gang members from a Cape Flats community in Cape Town make sense of their gang desistance. And I think it's important to highlight here that in my conceptualization of gang desistance in this study, I drew on the work of the criminologist Shad Maruna, and he argued that we need to look at desistance as not only the act of leaving a life of delinquency or a life of crime or a life of gangs, but also how that person is able to maintain a crime-free lifestyle after they have left the gang. So I'm looking at desistance with both of those aspects in mind. What I also did for this study is I drew on a resilience lens. So often resilience is kind of seen as something that should be applied only to individuals who have never succumbed to risk factors, but it has been also applied more broadly to include those who have successfully adapted or made a change after a period of risk or adversity. So this is, my study is in line with that second conceptualization. So I acknowledge that resilience can and should be applied to those who are at risk but don't succumb to risk factors. But here I focus on its application to how people join a gang but later leave, and how these desisters are able to manage and overcome the challenges associated with this process. And I chose to follow the work of Michael Unger and his conceptualization of resilience. So importantly, it's not defined in this study as an individual personality characteristic, but rather as an interaction between the individual and their environment. So within this definition, personal agency is seen as a key component of the resilience process, but it's the role of that individual's socio-ecological context, including their families, their community, government, to ensure that there are actually resources available for them to draw on. All right, just briefly to give you context for the methods that I used for the study. I interviewed 12 former gang members. The average length of their gang membership across all of them was 11 years, and the average length that they had been former gang members was 10 years, but there was quite a big range in this. So was one participant who'd been out of the gang for 1.5 years, and one who's much older and he'd been out for 23 years. So there was a range there. Also to note that half of the participants had been members of a gang in prison, along with being street gang members. In terms of my data collection, I interviewed all of the participants twice, with about a 1 to 3 month gap in between the interviews. And I focused on their life histories, but with a particular emphasis on understanding their desistance from gang involvement, as that was my topic. And the interviews themselves were semi-structured in nature. I had a list of open-ended and non-directive questions. And I also used a life history calendar as a tool during the interview. So as they were talking, kind of noting down key events on this life history timeline. And then in terms of the analysis, I used thematic narrative analysis, where the focus is on the content of the narrative, so what the participant is saying. And the process here was that I really analyzed on a case-by-case basis, so identifying stories within each of the participants' transcripts, coding these stories, and then comparing the stories across the participants, looking for patterns and commonalities. And then a bit of background to the study community. So for ethical reasons, I don't name the study community, but I will give you a little bit of context. In recent years, there has been some financial investment into this particular community, but for the most part, it is an impoverished area and it's got quite poor infrastructure and housing. It's also classified as a low-income community, characterized by very high rates of unemployment. And like many other Cape Flats community, it does have a high prevalence of drug abuse, of crime, gang involvement, and also gang-related violence. Okay, so I'm now going to move on to talk about the findings of my study, and I'm focusing here on their understanding of desisting from the gang. And again, as I mentioned, this is about looking at leaving the gang and also maintaining their reformed lifestyle. With the first theme, I'll highlight how the participants' desistance was a process punctuated by key turning points. I'll then turn to look at the participants' identity transformation, specifically looking at disillusionment with the gang life and the process of absolution that some of the participants discussed, and then the pro-social identities that they took up after desisting from gangsterism. And then I'll end off by talking about the protective resources that they drew on in their gang desistance, which included agency, personal responsibility taking, and also social and religious support. And you'll see that in order to ensure anonymity, I don't use the participants' real names. All right, so having a look at the first theme, desistance as a process with turning points. So I think the important thing to highlight here is that the participant stories indicated that desistance is not necessarily a single event or even a series of events. Rather, it's best understood as a process that has key turning points and that occurs gradually over time. And I think that this quote from participant 10 that's up on the screen here most clearly illustrates this. So participant 10 said that while he was in prison, he didn't have a desire to be a gangster anymore. And he said, I did really try to change for good. I did partake in everything that is good, even though I was a prison gangster. I did belong to the church group. I did all my social work classes that I'm supposed to attend. So I did do a lot of positive things in prison to make the change. But I had also the number, because the number was most my protection and who I am now in prison. So this story kind of demonstrates a fluidity between the gangster and the non-gangster identity. On the one hand, participant 10 wanted to leave gangsterism, and his actions in prison illustrated a commitment to this. But on the other hand, he still identified as a numbers gang member, as it was part of who he was while in prison. And there was also an instrumental element to this identity because it offered him protection. And then when participant 10 was eventually released from prison, he no longer saw himself as a gangster, but he continued to use his gang status to support his drug habit. A few years down the line, he became a father. And it was this experience of becoming a father that seemed to function as like a key turning point in his life, in that he cemented his commitment to changing his life for good. And in the interview, he said, and there I did make my mind up. No, I can't drug because his mother also drugged and I had to make a change. And it was at this point that he stopped using drugs and he left his gang for good. And I think what his story illustrates is that he drew on multiple identities over time and in different contexts. So for example, while he was in prison, he used his numbers gang identity when he needed protection, but perhaps when he was attending the programs offered in prison, he drew on a different non-gangster identity. So he moved between these different identities for some time before fully committing to changing his life when he became a father. Okay, then moving on to the next theme that I call disillusionment. A common reason that the participants cited in terms of joining their gang was that they felt that the gang would offer them a sense of brotherhood or sense of belonging. But over time, they became very disillusioned by this, usually as a result of a particular negative experience they had with their gang that again functioned as a turning point for them. As an example, participant 1 discussed how he was arrested and put in jail. And it was at this time that he came to realize that the gang life was not for him. And when I asked him to explain this a bit more, he said, I realized my own friends, they didn't care for me. They didn't bail me out. It was experiences like this that prompted the participants to reflect on their gang involvement and come to a realization that this gangster identity didn't resonate with them anymore. The theme of disillusionment more generally, I feel, is well illustrated in one of participant 8's stories, which is a very powerful story. And he decided to leave his gang while he was in prison. And when talking about his prison gang, he said, they make all these promises, telling you that should anything happen to you, it'll happen to them also. But reality struck. A coffin is made for one, you see. If I die now, I won't get a coffin where you're going to lay next to me. You're going to get your own coffin, and I'm going to get my own coffin, which shows me that I carry my own package and you carry your own package. For most of the participants, it was this sense of disillusionment with the support and the brotherhood that the gang allegedly offers that played a really pivotal role in their decision to leave their gang. Then there were also some participants whose stories centered on a theme of what I've called absolution. And for these participants, a particular religious experience enabled them to feel absolved of and make amends for the crimes that they'd committed in their past, which for them was really key to their desistance process. As an example, participant 4 discussed his religious conversion after deciding to leave his gang. And he said, that night I did convert. I just feel, hey, there's something going off my back, like a heavy thing. But like I say, it's unexplainable. I was relieved from something, like there was something on me, like was heavy on my back. But how can I say, I can't explain it. But that time I was just feeling was the relief from it, you see. Participant 4 at the time that he was interviewed worked in the community with gang involved youth. And when he was reflecting on this, he said, I'm very glad for the life I live today, because why? That time I was putting in the negative for the lighties, but today I'm putting in the positive. Another kind of sub-element to this absolution theme was the participants' ability to, once they had made a change, express emotions and feel empathy for others as a result of a particular religious experience. So as an example, participant 11, who discussed a religious conversion that he had in prison, he said, by accepting the Lord and by growing, I realized, yo, I can cry. And a bit later on in the interview, when he was reflecting more on it, he said, and I was so glad when I realized, wow, I can cry. It shows me that now I'm changing. I could cry. And when sometimes I watch a film and I can relate to somebody that gets hurt, to me, that makes sense. And I said, Lord, thank you, because I was in a place where I had no feeling. And I think what this suggests is that while this participant was a gang member, he dissociated from his experiences. For him and perhaps for other gang members, dissociation may well have been necessary. But this seemed to change when he had a religious experience where often emotional expression is valued and crying is seen as a normal part of the faith-based experience. And then along with expressing emotions, participant 11 also started to feel empathy for others, illustrating kind of a humanization-like process where he transformed from being a hardened gangster to a much more feeling human being. So for some participants, a particular religious experience functioned as a turning point for them, in that it enabled them to absolve themselves of and make amends for their past gang life and to kind of let go of that gangster identity. But at the same time, the religious experience also facilitated an emotional change in these participants, in that they moved from a hardened stoic gangster to emotionally sensitive and aware individuals. And I'll come back to the religious theme a bit later on. All right, then the next theme was around taking up pro-social identities. And this was something that was really key in supporting the participants in their desistance process. And the stories indicated that this identity included both being a positive role model to their families and also in their communities. So as an example, participant 2 said, I've got a 6-year-old son who's growing up, so I want to be a mirror for him. At the end of the day, he can speak good of me. If people ask him, for instance, how do you know your daddy? Then he can say, no, man, my daddy's a good person. That's why I decided to change for myself and for my son. And then another example from participant 6, who discussed being a role model for youth in his community. He specifically does outreach work with youngsters who are involved in crime and substance abuse. And when talking about this and reflecting on it, he said, I must be a role model. I must be an example. I must be the one who is talking to them. I must be the one that will show them through my lifestyle that change is possible. So I have to show them in many ways. I need to prove to them that change is possible. It can come from anybody. And I think what this indicates is that for these participants, being a positive role model to others, to their families, to the communities, it gave them a sense of meaning and a sense of purpose in their lives, which I think acted as an internal protective resource in supporting them kind of in their desistance journey, specifically in maintaining reform, so being able to stay away from a life of gangsterism. All right, I'm now going to pay some attention to the other kinds of protective resources, both within themselves and in their environments, that the participants drew on in their process of desistance. The first thing to acknowledge is that personal agency was key to the participants' desistance, in that they formed a very clear and purposeful intention to change their lives, usually after having a particular experience with their gang that resonated with them. So as an example, participant 2 said, the police caught me with a magazine of bullets, and then I talked me out of it. I got me out of it. I was beaten out very, very badly. This is when I decided, no, enough is enough. I can't go on like this. I sell drugs for one person, but then the next time then I get caught, then I must go to jail, and no one is there for me, and only my family turns up. So again, this is illustrating the disillusionment theme that I spoke about earlier. But I'm using this quote here to kind of show the personal agency that he formed this very purposeful intention to change. And along with that, the participants' stories also reflected taking responsibility for their past, and that sort of helped them to move on. As an example, participant 5 said, I used to blame my father while I was in jail. You know, it's because of him that I'm behind bars. It's because of him that my brothers are dead. It's because of him that we're gangsters. But it came so far where I said to myself, I'm tired of blaming people. You know, it's time to blame myself. It's time to look at my own faults that I do, my own mistakes, my own roles. It's time for me to rectify it. I think the really important thing to highlight here is that while the participants' agency and their personal responsibility taking played a role in their desistance from gangsterism, the resources provided by their social context were key in this process. So a person might have every intention of wanting to make a change and made that decision to change, but in order for this intention to be realized, they have to have an enabling social context that supports and maintains this change. And for the participants in the study, this included being able to access social support via their loved ones, the community, and education and rehabilitation programs in prison, and also religious support, and I'll turn to the social support and religious support now. So for many of the participants, it was their family members who played a very supportive role in helping them to exit the gang life and also to stop using drugs. So I think I need to highlight here that the majority of participants used and abused drugs while they were in their gangs, and their process of desistance from the gang was often intertwined with also stopping drugs. For participants like participant 3, their family members were able to connect them to a form of social capital. And in the study, it was the organization from which most of them were recruited that offered affordable and easily accessible rehabilitation and gang intervention services. And when talking about this organization, participant 3 said, my mother found out about this place and she did send me here to the rehab and it changed my life. Many of the participants also had access to continued support through this organization, so it wasn't a once-off. As an example, participant 2, when he was reflecting on when he was part of the gang intervention program, he said, every week they came to check up on me. How am I doing? What do I need? Do they need to go to my family to go ask for this and go ask for that? And then they take you out on a lunch break maybe and have one-on-one sessions with you. This kind of continued practical and emotional support is really important as individuals who leave the gang life are likely to face an array of different challenges after leaving, including finding employment. Participant 11 was able to manage this particular challenge by working for his church when he came out of prison. And he said, you see the church here, the only thing why I stayed away totally from gangsterism coming out, otherwise I would have been on the street. This church is prepared, they give me 3,000 Rand a month, so now I can give something to my wife. And I think what this points to is the important role that faith-based institutions can play in not only sort of emotionally supporting individuals, but practically supporting them. They can offer a social network that can connect individuals to resources, which can include financial support. Other participants in the study were able to access social support through key figures in their community. So as an example, participant 7 spoke about how he turned to his probation officer when he needed support. Just a bit of background, while he was in his gang, he was charged with possession of a weapon. And once he had already left the gang, he was given a 3-year suspended sentence. So he was reflecting on this particular experience. And he said, the parole officer actually motivated me. He actually told me something that I had actually took with me up until now. He told me, you can do it, but you need to take one day at a time, you know, for those 3 years. So I decided, okay, cool, let's just try this, you know. Every day I just progress, and progress. So for this participant, the guidance from his probation officer helped him to manage his 3-year suspended sentence. And then there were some participants, those who spent time in prison, who discussed the social support that they received while in prison. Unfortunately, many of South Africa's prisons suffer from severe overcrowding and staff shortages, thereby limiting the availability and effectiveness of rehabilitation services. But in this study, there were several participants who discussed engaging with the rehabilitation programs that were on offer and the positive impacts that this had on their desistance. As an example, participant 5 spoke about his experience of receiving an education and also doing anger management courses in prison. And he said, my teacher always came and he said to me, you see what you can do this, you know. And I passed NTC2 and I said to myself, wow, I passed NTC2, that's grade 10. You know, because I was very aggressive. So I started to work on my anger. You know, I went back to the anger management, start to work. I managed from NTC2 until NTC4. I completed my matric, my grade 12. So it's important to note here that participant 5, he didn't exit the gang life while he was in prison, but the education he received in school, in prison, stood him in good stead for his later change. So after exiting gangsterism, when he was out of prison, he actually went on to pursue a tertiary education. And then a very common theme across the participants was the support that they received through their religious belief systems. Here I will note that, you know, this isn't surprising because they were drawn from a faith-based organization, but nonetheless their stories, their experiences of religion were really profound and clearly played a big role in their desistance. And I think that one of the ways in which religion supported them is that it helped them to maintain a reformed lifestyle. So as an example, participant 8 said, if there's one thing that I can say that the power source for me, staying the way I am, first of all, it's God. It's him that keeps me, that sustains me. Because there's many times in my life when, why should I still walk this road? Whereby it's so much easier if I would just go back to the life of crime. It's so much easier to get money. It's so much easier to get what I want. But then God reminds me, telling me, do you know where I've taken you from? Don't forget it. So his story illustrates that his religious beliefs gave him a cognitive frame through which he could understand his past and how he ended up where he is today, which motivates him to continue along that same path. And I think what was also very interesting about this religious theme is that the participants described how becoming religious is seen as an acceptable way of exiting gangsterism, because the gangs themselves seem to have this like inherent respect for religious institutions. And when I probed a bit more on this, one of the participants said, if you make your exit towards like, I'm accepting Christ, so you're making an exit to a higher power, they respect that. And I wanted a little bit of information, so I asked him to explain this, and he said, because it's like you're not turning your back on the gang. And then another participant explored this, and he said how at the back of their mind, in their heart, they know it's the right thing. All right, I'm going to end off just talking through some kind of practical implications that I think should be taken into consideration when it comes to intervening with gang-involved youth, sort of drawn from my study and its findings. So firstly, just to say that the data from the study, which is also supported by gang and crime desistance literature, suggests that desistance is best understood as a process that is punctuated by key turning points. And these turning points can be both negative, for example, not feeling supported by one's gang peers, or positive, for example, becoming a father or embracing fatherhood. But what's important here is that the desisting gang member needs to actually experience these turning points as personally meaningful to them, in that the turning point prompts them to actually actively reflect on their gang life and to form an intention to make a change. So given the difficulty in determining when exactly turning points will actually resonate with a potential desister, it's important to offer interventions, I would argue, repeatedly and as much as possible. I would also say that intervention programs may want to encourage a level of personal responsibility taking in youth who decide to leave their gangs, while also still being mindful of the particular context of the individual that may have shaped their decision to become involved in the gang in the first place. While an individual, as I said at the start of the presentation, might have every intention of changing their behavior, their environment needs to support this intention. And the family may be able to play a really key role here, in that often, at least in the case of these participants, they were sort of the first port of call when the participant decided to make a change. So this points to the importance of including not only the individual, but their family in gang intervention programs. Once an individual has made a decision to leave a gang, they're likely to face an array of challenges and difficulties, for example, finding legitimate employment, and they'll therefore need a supportive network that offers continued practical and emotional support to help them continue along a pro-social path and to resist any temptations or pressures to re-engage with crime or gang-related activities. The families of desisting gang members need to be educated on these matters and equipped with the skills that help them to best support the desister. But this kind of support doesn't only have to come from families, as the data in this study showed. It could also come from community figures such as probation officers. And then another thing to highlight is that given some of the participants began their process of desistance while they were in prison, offering rehabilitation programs through the prison system is another possible intervention pathway. And also because a turn to religion in desistance is common, and this is a finding not only in my work, but in other desistance work. Given that, well, it's not only the turn to religion, but I think the fact that it gives people a sense of meaning and purpose, a means of absolution for past crimes, and also that it's respected by the gang itself. Intervention programs that are faith-based or that incorporate sort of a faith-based element might also be able to play a supportive role. And then given that a desisting gang member might also be trying to stop drugs at the same time, this was the case with many of my participants and is common in the desistance literature, gang intervention services should also include a focus on substance abuse rehabilitation. And then lastly, I think that gang intervention programs should include an element that focuses on encouraging participants to be positive role models to their families and the communities, because this can give them a sense of meaning and a sense of purpose, which ultimately supports them in their desistance. This could be done by providing them with opportunities to give back to their communities, by working with high-risk youth, and also, including a focus on fatherhood. So in conclusion, it's imperative that interventions that assist desisting gangsters are targeted not only on an individual level, but a contextual level too, ensuring that individuals have access to the kinds of protective resources in their environment that will support their desistance. And that is my last slide. It's an article that Kathy and I recently published, so I'm just popping it up there in case you want to read any more, and I will stop there. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Jane. That was excellent and perfect timekeeping. Anyone with a question, please raise your hand or signal it in the chat, or even put the question into the chat. We already have a question from Tunde. Tunde, to unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. It's very interesting, and I agree with the statement that sometimes the gang promises them a lot of things. For instance, from the scenario in Nigeria, it promises them a lot. That okay, look at this musician, he's very popular, he has money, he's wealthy. So they promise them that they will be the same, that they will connect them to those popular musicians. So that serves as a kind of motivating factor to pull young people into cult group or gang groups. Now, the question I have is, do you think that people actually desist 100% from gangs? For instance, in Nigeria, there's a theory of biological determinism that people don't desist from crime. Absolutely, they can only step behind for a period of time. They have a tendency to join again. Now, the question is, do they actually desist because of the morality or for the sake of humanity, or because the group has refused to fulfill their promises? So if they see another group that they feel will fulfill those promises, are they likely to go back? For instance, in Nigeria, we have seen cases where gang members leave one gang for another group because they feel that the former gang has failed to fulfill its promises. So they switch, they cross-carpet to another group. So do you think that it is possible 100% for people to leave their group? In Nigeria, for instance, gangs have a way of greeting. When they check, they have a way of twisting their fingers. There's a case of a pastor who was a former gang member in the university. So while he was growing old, he started having children, and he feel like, no, I shouldn't be doing this again. I shouldn't be hanging out with my friends. So he stepped behind. But whenever he sees his former members, he still greets them the same way. For instance, when he wants to greet them, he covers the hand with the Bible so that people will not know that he was a former gang member. He covers it. So I'm thinking, is it possible for people to desist 100% from being a gang member? That's the question that's very much interesting to me. Thank you.
Thanks, Tunde. This is a very interesting question and something that I grappled with while I was writing up my PhD. And to be honest, I never came to like a firm answer. I think the first thing to recognize is in some of the desistance literature, they talk about this idea of like primary desistance and then secondary desistance. And it's about, sorry, I'm just collecting my thoughts. There's definitely like arguments in the literature that that maybe you can never fully leave the gang, particularly because of the kind of the emotional and the social network that you have with that gang. With my participants, I don't know. You know, my impression was yes, they had, but you know, who am I to say? But I think the point that I'm trying to make is that there is, you know, other people have written about this, and there is evidence that shows that it's kind of like I think their involvement wanes over time. So I think it's not something that comes through clearly in my presentation, but it's this process of like, it's not like you decide to leave the gang and that's it, you've cut off all ties completely. You know, definitely over time your ties lessen and lessen. Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have like a complete answer for your question. It is something that I grappled with a lot. And I suppose, you know, if I were to ask the men that I interviewed directly, they would be like, yeah, you know, of course I've left completely. But whether or not that's actually the case, who's to know? But the impression that I got was that even if they did still have some connections, they had a new life, if that makes sense. It was like they'd embraced this new identity. Sorry, there was something you said that interested me. Oh, you were talking about, did you say that in Nigeria there's examples of like people moving to other gangs? Am I right?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
For instance, in Nigeria, basically we have two groups that are really two popular groups. One is Eye, the other one is Aye. Eye is spelled E-I-Y-E. Aye is spelled A-I-Y-E. So the difference is the first letter. One is A, another one is I. So the Aye group has a lot of popular people in the music industry, even in politics. So when people join a particular group, based on what the group promised them before they join, so they expect them to fulfill those promises, especially musicians. People who want to go into music, want to become rappers. So when they feel that, okay, no, this group is not fulfilling my promises, but look at my friends who join another group, they are doing well. They cross carpet, but they get a lot of threats from the group from which they just left. So people move from one group to another in Nigeria.
That's very interesting. I think in South Africa it's a bit different because the gangs are largely based on different territories. So it's unlikely that someone would leave, you know, if you're living in a certain area, you wouldn't leave for a gang in another area. And even in the same area, they compete and they fight. But what does happen sometimes is that you'll have like kind of a bigger gang and then splinter gangs off that. And they might move between the splinter gangs or move to the bigger gang. But as far as I know, there isn't kind of moving between sort of competing gangs. Yeah.
Okay. Well, oh, Veronica's just gone. So was Veronica, are you with us? Veronica had a question.
Yes, I am with you. Sorry, I've just got noisy dogs also. I have one comment and two questions, if that's okay. And I'm sorry if I missed something in the early part of the seminar. The one comment is I find it fascinating that you're talking about how gangs respect religion. Working in Pollsmoor and Goodwood, that certainly has been my experience. With it's advocated as a rehabilitation medium by the Bavarders, the warders, and the general ethos with people I've worked with. And I wonder to what extent there isn't some overlap between gang rules and regulations and hierarchy and the system that religion with its hierarchies, with its relationships in a very often very highly structured way, doesn't provide the same kind of constraints, and therefore becomes a more secure space for people to desist and hopefully transform. Anyway, that's just a comment. But my question is around two things. And just as a little bit of an intro, I work with a theatre company made up of ex-prisoners, and I was working in Pollsmoor until COVID came along. So my question is did you find any correlations between desistance and age? And I see Ilona has just written something into the chat about precisely that. A lot of the time in Goodwood, the men were talking about joining the gang as a rite of passage in their youth, outside and also inside. And that rite of passage being very much associated with the youth. But some studies that I've been looking at elsewhere, and in particular with theatre companies in the UK, there's a lot of talk about how people reach a particular age and then start to desist from crime, but I'm not sure about it in relation to gang culture. And then the other question is about the financial support. You've spoken a lot about the psychosocial and drug rehab support and the need for that. But one of the things I've found with my theatre company is that I've been able to give them a small stipend per month, which has meant that people haven't necessarily returned to the same behaviors that landed them in the prison in the first place. That hasn't worked 100%. We've had 2 members of the theatre company who've gone back to prison, both drug-related crimes. So just interesting I'd be interested to hear, especially around the age thing, what your findings may be. And
Thanks,
thank
Veronica.
you. Thank you. Really interesting.
Oh, thanks. And thank you for those questions. And I'd love to connect afterwards if that's okay. So yeah, first thing on your comment about the respect for religious institutions and kind of the absolutely, like that was definitely, it wasn't a link that that I think the participants directly spoke about, but it was something that came to mind for me, that the gangs have like very specific rules and regulations and kind of the structure to them. And what I sort of hypothesized was that religion can offer that exact same structure. So yes, 100% agree. Okay, the age correlation. It wasn't something that I directly looked at, but from what I understand and what the literature shows us is that there's kind of this, I think it was Terry Moffat who originally proposed the idea of adolescent limited antisocial behavior versus life course persistent antisocial behavior. So basically the life course persistent people are those that they're in it and they're usually in it for life. But the adolescent limited ones are exactly that. Young people who, for whatever reason, rite of passage circumstances, they become involved in a gang or they become involved in crime. And it can be for like sort of a short period of time and then they leave. But our context in South Africa, because this evidence comes mostly from high-income countries, it's a little bit different because it's what I think is that they end up staying sometimes beyond just adolescence, so kind of into like late 20s, early 30s, because of sort of the difficulty of actually being able to leave the gang. So there's all sorts of challenges that sort of prevent them from leaving. It wasn't a theory that I, applied to my PhD specifically, but it is something that I've read up on before. And yeah, I think that's a useful way of trying to understand it: the adolescent limited antisocial behavior versus the life course persistent. And that in our South African setting, it's actually kind of adolescent and a little bit longer. There was something else I wanted to say on that, and now it's gone. It might come back to me. And then your question about financial support. Yes, it's not something that I covered in my presentation, but it was definitely there. So I think my group were perhaps unique because the organization that I recruited them from, most of them were either like kind of working for or supporting the organization in some way. And so through that, they either got a stipend or, you know, a full salary, sort of depending on funding. And that was definitely, you know, a big help. I wouldn't say it was the way they spoke and their stories, it wasn't something that stood out sort of the most, but it definitely was there. Yeah, and it did play a role. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Very interesting.
Well, I wonder, Jane, if I could push you a bit more on this question of age that Veronica raised. So what I really liked about your presentation was how you wove together very nicely the sort of the internal dynamics with the sort of the external factors. And again, you showed how, in a sense, the sort of the social pressures and the social opportunities on people, you know, were informed their own thinking. So, as you said, you gave us the example of the gang member who was disillusioned because the gang didn't provide the support that he had expected, right? And then there was other who did find support in the church or found support amongst social workers in prison and so on. Right, so there's a lovely sort of combination of external, internal factors here, which I think makes a lot of sense. Right, and in the chat, I think you know, Alona's sort of raised another possible point, which I think she's saying, well, maybe the gangs don't really want these older members very much; they really want the younger ones. So, in a sense, that you know, that feeling alienated from a gang might be quite as you get older, might be quite a reaction because they want people like armies. They want people who are going to act without thinking. They don't want people who are going to think before they act. Which is why armies have adolescents and young adults, not older people for the most part. Anyway, but my question is this: is that, like Veronica, I'm wondering whether, you know, what you're doing is very practical. You're pointing to possible interventions, right? But if you take a step back, right, there's a bit more of a sort of a causal story that I think you might be you might go into in more detail, right? And particularly how this is affected by age, right? So you said at one point that one of your participants sort of said enough is enough. Well, but why is enough enough? And is this simply a product of, you know, of having been in a gang for a certain period of time, or is it perhaps because, you know, in society that there's a whole set of factors that they are maybe not only somewhat aware of, and perhaps even don't point to when they're talking to you, but might nonetheless be very important. I mean, I'm thinking that you know, in their 20s, being in a gang might be cool, but if you're still in a gang in your 40s, your 50s, you're probably a loser, right? Now, how, you know, is that a factor? How does, you know, did you have, you know, I want to sort of push you on this age thing. You know, how much of this disillusionment and so on is really age related? Because in fact, there are a whole set of norms and values and beliefs in the wider society which propel, which are very difficult to resist and propel people as they get older into different forms of behavior. And, you know, I'm looking at your work from, not so much from the vantage point of gangs, but from the vantage points of sort of youth studies generally. I mean, we've got, what I like about your work is that it's pointing to the transition out of youth into something else. And almost all of the work in South Africa on youth focuses on transitions, on what happens when people are youth, right? If you're with me, right? And very little on desistance, or how they transit into something else. And we know that for lots of people in South Africa, you know, youth extends to a very long time because for all sorts of reasons. But we've got a very, very poor understanding of what happens to people in their 30s and the 40s as they transition from the kinds of behavior we associate with people in their 20s to the kinds of behavior that we can observe amongst people in their 50s. Something changes and we don't have a very good understanding. And your work is really contributing to that, I think. But I think I push you to think more about how this age factor is framing the choices and the pressures that you discussed so nicely.
Thank you, Jeremy. You've given me a lot of food for thought. And I must admit, I think it's probably a gap in my work, but a PhD can never cover everything. I don't know, Alona, maybe I'll do a postdoc or something on this, or a little sub-study. Yeah, I mean, I don't have any kind of immediate responses to that, but just to say that I completely take your point, and I think it would be worth going back to my data and looking specifically at the role of age. I also just want to highlight, though, that there were sort of early 20s participants that that left their gang at that age. And I think what I also struggle with is that it's a small sample, so like what sort of conclusions can I draw on that? Yeah, but very, very interesting point, and lots of food for thought. So thank you.
Tulani.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. Kelly Jane, I usually call it Kelly Jane, but it's only today I realized I should say Jane Kelly. I've referred to quite a lot in my some of my publications in around gangs, me and one of my master students. I found your work very interesting. Just two questions quickly. It's around the type of gangs, because apparently it's easier to leave certain kind of gangs based on the kind of culture and the criminal activities that are involved in that kind of certain type of gangs, as opposed to certain types of gangs. I'd be interested in your participants, which type of gangs do they belong to? Perhaps also linked, I don't know if you explore that with their criminal histories as well. And then another second question linked to that, maybe you've covered it in your thesis, maybe you can share with us how you could have verified the data or what they shared to you, because one of the critiques most of us, we do these studies, we rely mainly on the self-report data, what they tell us, but sometimes often we get a feedback that's no, that's not enough. That's got to be verified, certain sources or records for that matter. But if you may want to share with us just a little bit, if there's any data verification. Thank you.
Thanks, Tulani, for those questions. So your first question with the type of gang, I would say that, yes, I think, yeah, the type of gang, it can definitely play a role in, sort of the level of difficulty in leaving, but also the sort of the position of the person in the gang. So, the people that I was interviewing, they were kind of at the sort of foot soldier level and just above that, if that makes sense. And I think that perhaps that level, it's a bit easier. To be honest, you asked about sort of criminal histories. It wasn't something that I delved into. They did sort of share stories, but it wasn't sort of the focus of my topic. And then verification of data, yes, absolutely. And there were actually a couple of times where participants shared something that like just didn't quite fit, or I just wanted to make a bit more sense of it. What I did there is, and I suppose it's not sort of proper verification, but the director of the NGO who helped me recruit these men, he was kind of like a vouch for for their changed lifestyle, and it was him and the manager working there who basically, I gave them the requirements. I said, okay, I'd like to interview men who have desisted from gangs. They had to have been out for, I think I said, at least a year and a half. And so that was sort of the first verification part. And then where there were sort of areas where I wasn't sure about things, that I could check with them and kind of validate stories in that way. But again, that's perhaps a limitation, that I did only predominantly rely on self-report data. And one thing that I considered when I was doing my interviews, but there just wasn't sort of scope for it, is interviewing their family members as well, to get their perspective, and also as a kind of a means of verification.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you. Thank you
Pleasure.
very much. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
I'm not seeing any other hands up or any other questions. Here's an opportunity. mean, maybe Jane, you could reflect a little bit more on this last point about, you know, who you interview. I mean that you know, a generation ago, structuralism pervaded South African social sciences, and we attributed everything to sort of structural factors, and then kind of swung around to thinking that everything was experiential. But if we, you know, if it does occur to me that if you only interview the participants, the people who are actually making the decisions about whether they leave or not, right? You know, you're probably getting the most important part of the story, but you might not be getting the whole story, because you know, there might well be things that they are not. It's not just that they might not want to talk about, but that there might be things that they're not aware of, or they're not conscious of, or cannot articulate. So did you said that you considered interviewing family members or others? You didn't for logistical reasons, or, I mean, yeah, in the real world, practical constraints are important.
Yeah, I think it was that, Jeremy. You know, I sort of saw my PhD as I really wanted to focus on their life stories. Like, that for me was what was important. So it was a practical, but also just an interest of mine, you know, I sort of made that decision. Yeah, you were asking about yeah, sort of who they are, and before I started the project, I had conversations with people like Don Pinnock, and that was exactly kind of the critique that he raised. He said, well, you know, how are these guys going to know exactly what it was that helped them change? You know, their perspective is obviously important, but there's so many other factors at play. Yeah, so I suppose a fuller, sort of more complete study would be you know, interviewing people from the organization where they were recruited from, interviewing the family members. But, you know, for a PhD, at some point, you kind of have to make a decision of like which path you're going to go down. Yeah, and I was very interested in their narratives. So I kept the focus on that. Yeah.
I think Veronica has another question. Veronica.
It's a bit of an anecdote in a way, and that is working in Pollsmoor. Generally speaking, we work twice a week for 3 hours at a time. And there were some minor kind of gang issues within the group, but with some selective swearing and quite a lot of semi-aggressive attitude from me, I managed to convince them that actually they were in the theatre gang, and that their numbers gang, and most of them were in numbers gangs in Pollsmoor, as well as the people in my outside group now. And the 27s, 28s dominated those two, but probably 28s most. And what did occur, and of course this is anecdotal and reported, and people know that you want to hear certain things, but the group has over and over since we started reiterated that they are like a family and their support structure is interdependent. Of course, the difficulty from my point of view is that they then enroll me as the mother figure, and that has its own complications. And so the replacement of the structures, religion, yes, that features strongly, but having an outside interest and having a group to locate yourself in that is hopefully a little bit more pro-social, notwithstanding the deviant nature of most theatre making, has really been made evident to me over the last while. Oh, and what was the name of the person, Moffat, who you mentioned to me earlier?
Terry Moffat.
With a Y or an I at the end?
I think it's with an I. I'll double check and I'll message you.
Okay, super. Thank you.
Last thoughts, Jane?
Just to say, thank you everyone for listening. I haven't looked at this work for a while, and I really want to start working on a paper looking specifically at kind of the identity transformation elements that came through in the stories. And I think doing this has now spurred me on to actually pay attention to that. So thanks everyone.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very, very much, Jane. If it wasn't 2 o'clock, we'd say we haven't had enough. We want more. It is 2 o'clock. Thank you to the audience. And if you're not receiving email notices about the seminars, please let us know and we'll make sure you're on the contact list. Thank you very much, everybody. If you do stay on and to talk to Jane after the seminar formally ends, don't forget that it's probably still being recorded. Just a warning. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody. Congratulations.
Thank you. Cheers, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Jane, I'll stay on if you want to chat a bit more.
It'd be great. Yeah.
And I'll switch off the recording so you guys
Oh,
can
okay.
chat.
Thanks.
Thank you. Jane, I'm going to fetch some water.
Okay, no problem.